Hello everyone, it's Rem here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're well today. So today we're going to be doing part 2 of the topic INFJs in the workplace. You know, if you remember, yesterday we were talking about how having a 9 to 5, working in management can be tricky for any kind of introverts. That the functions T and SI were probably very useful functions to have in a workplace environment, and that extroversion particularly was an advantage. That the FE function is a really useful function to navigate interpersonal relations and work well with your team and define projects and goals. But that in the case of INFJs, often NI predominates, and NI doesn't seem to be a function that is really correlated with any of the typical characteristics that make you stand out in a 9 to 5. Might be a function that makes you stand out in thought, in psychological insight, in friendship, friendly advice, in writing, in literature, in art analysis. But when it comes to 9 to 5, what are the sort of big perks that NI has? That's it's a legitimate question to ask yourself. So we want to sort of find out how an INFJ can thrive in a workplace environment, knowing that there are just cases where that choice has been made and the INFJ won't be able to just say, okay, like I'm going to quit everything and start studying again to, become a psychologist or an academic or whatever. For some people, that's a very difficult path to choose, despite, what Sartre would have us believe with this concept of radical freedom, although it is a legitimate thing to talk about. So maybe I'll start mentioning that bit about radical freedom and bad faith, and then I'll move on to the little kind of personality frameworks that I mentioned at the end of the last video regarding specifically work roles and how that intersects with the personality type MBTI and the personality type of the INFJ. Now, before I move on with my topic, just remember I have written a book on the INFJ, the Ecstatic Soul. 82 reviews online. Check them out on Amazon. Link down below. Consider getting it. Less than $10. And also less than $10, my new novel, The Infinite Castle. Look at this lovely product. Support my work. You will not regret it. Okay. So we have this situation. An INFJ for X, Y, and Z reasons is in a 9 to 5. That is probably the case with a lot of us, partly because 9 to 5s are so common, office work is so common, it's very so coterminous in some sense with advanced capitalism, and it's not actually that easy to work in academia. It's very competitive, and in fact it's starting to require more and more of the extroverted skills that the INFJ doesn't have. You need to be able to promote yourself a lot in academia, and it's not just merit-based. You can have very impressive thesis, but if you don't really promote it actively, then you're going to be at a disadvantage. And again, if we consider that the INFJ is not thriving most in that area, that's an issue. So it's hard to become a lecturer. It's hard to be a psychotherapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, again, for reasons that I covered in the last video regarding your own mental well-being. And it's a mistake to think that you're very psychologically insightful because you've introspected on yourself a lot, therefore you're going to be a good analyst. That's not necessarily the case. And some teacher, well, INFJs can be good teachers, but being a teacher in primary school or secondary school dealing with kids, it's not for everyone. So 9 to 5s. So again, two situations. Either you come to the conclusion that it really doesn't suit you, and so you're looking for a way to quit, but you're scared because of all the uncertainty that comes with it, or you choose the path of sticking to it and trying to find a way to thrive better. So In relation to the first choice, I would say, Sartre or Sartrean radical freedom is basically the idea that bad faith is a consubstantial condition or features of the human condition, whereby we justify to ourselves a lot of choices that we do not make because it seems like it would require a lot of sacrifices, and we're afraid, even though there's a part of us that really wants to make that transition, but it would require a lot of sacrifices, and so a lot of harrowing thought and dreads and doubts. And in order to not have to think about it too much, we just come up with something like a sort of rational justification of why we can't do it, and why there's no choice. We have to sort of stick to what we're already doing. So that's bad faith. It means that we convince ourselves that we're not free, even though in fact we are free. So there's a deep thought in there, and it's worth considering for some people, particularly, let's say, the people who are not restricted or not constrained by the fact that maybe they have a mortgage, maybe they have debts, maybe they have maybe they're in a marriage, they have a family, maybe they're young parents, maybe there are other members in their family that need support. So bad faith and the Sartrean concept is useful, but it's really up to a point. You really have to take into account the facticity of every person. And there are many of us who just for very practical, pragmatic reasons just have to find a way of thriving within that office environment. So which leads us to that other approach. So now the model that I was talking about yesterday, which was introduced to me by my father, is called something that I cannot remember, but it's divided into 4 main categories. So instead of having 16, there's 4 main categories of the employee, again, in the work environments, let's say in this case in an office environment, which is further subdivided into 8 because each person has a dominant trait and an auxiliary trait of each. So it will become a bit clearer when I sort of dive into what these categories are. So number 1 profile, I'll just list the profiles for now, and then I'll go into a bit of detail as to what they are. But just to be aware, at least as far as France is concerned, that's a personality grid that some managers who care about this kind of thing, use. So the number 1 profile is called the promoter. Second profile is called the controller. The third profile is called the analyst, and the fourth profile is called the supporter. Okay. So promoter, controller, analyst, and supporter. And so that's 4 types, okay? Most of the time, people are not pure types, but they're a kind of blend of 2 with a dominant one. So you can be either a promoter-controller or a controller-promoter. If you're a promoter-controller, your dominant is the promoter, but you have controller-esque traits, or the reverse. You can have a promoter analyst, analyst controller, supporter analyst, supporter controller, controller supporter, and so on. So you get a lot of different types on the basis of that, combinations. But usually we have a dominance, and that kind of dominant has to be respected in some way. And each of these have contexts where they thrive, and contexts where they stress out, stress generators. And if you look at those various stress generators and grounds of satisfaction, and you crisscross them with the typical traits of the INFJ, you can potentially make some pretty interesting discoveries or garner some interesting insights. So, for example, the promoter is one I'm familiar with because my dad identifies as a promoter, auxiliary controller, promoter controller, and so I'm quite familiar with that profile. As you'll see in a second, it's not a profile that is very consonant with the INFJ personality, and therefore it probably would be better to avoid jobs for promoters, even though they would satisfy a lot of extroverted types, particularly maybe Enneagram Type 3, image-focused Enneagram types, if you're familiar with that type. The promoter is essentially a type, they tend to be very extroverted or quite extroverted, quite socially fluent, and they like achieving things and getting recognition for things. They get so that provides to their satisfaction, contribute satisfaction in their life, getting recognition and novelty. They're always looking for a new challenge, new things. money is not necessarily what concerns them the most. It's just new projects and recognition for their achievements. So, you know, there's quite a 3-dimension, maybe a bit of Enneagram 7 thrown in the mix as well, in the promoter. Now, the stressors are going to be monotony, not enough change. Okay? Now, that's very different for an INFJ, you see, because there are going to be stressors for INFJs. And not to say that INFJs love monotony or not, you know, or a lack of change, but a little bit of change, a little bit of deviation from monotony, not constant change. That's great for the promoter. The controller is someone who likes to have deadlines, likes to have targets, also likes to have things in order constantly. And also an important trait of the controller is that they like to do the things, you know, they like to be told, okay, like this needs to be done by that time, but then to have the freedom to do what they want to do in their own way. They don't like having to be told how to do it. So they're okay with being given a deadline and, you know, particular project, but they don't like to be told how to do it. They like to have control over what they're doing. So they have a little bit of strictness around this, and they're not that flexible. But at the same time, they can work to deadlines, and they're pretty good also at knowing how to, you know, tell people what to do and so on. Although not all the time, but, you know, if it's combined with some other types, that can be done. So that's controller type. And then you have the supporter and the analyst. Now, the thing to understand about the analyst and the supporter is that, again, like they have different stressors. The analyst, the stressor is time. The source of satisfaction is accumulation of knowledge, insight, having the time to feel like they're mastering a particular topic and being consulted and being competent. But again, they don't, or very unlike the promoter, if they're given like 7 things to do in one day, that's going to generate a huge amount of stress. Now, with a supporter, well, you know, it's a little bit like the ISFJ type personality. So they're stressed if they're put in a position to have to manage, to basically be in the position of, say, a controller or something like that. They need to be given clear directions. So they can be a manager, but on the condition that there's someone above them that clarifies things for them. They're very reliable, etc., and they get the strong feeling of satisfaction from being an active contributor to the well-being of a particular unit, department, or company. Now, I think that for an INFJ, if you look at these different profiles, you'll come to the conclusion that for the typical INFJ, they're not a promoter, so you forget about all the jobs that are kind of aligned with promoters. They have a little bit of the controller in them, maybe not ease with managing people, but certainly with like a certain dislike of being told how to do things. Okay, so, but at the same time, the INFJ is not necessarily going to be very comfortable working to deadlines, because time for an INFJ is a massive factor, and they like to take their time. They need to take their time to understand, to accumulate knowledge, insights, and feel like they're competent. So they're much more likely to be correlated with analysts with a little bit of controller. Alternatively, maybe for the INFJs that are more oriented to like Enneagram 2, for instance, and there's lots of them, it seems at first sight that that's more associated with female INFJs at first sight, but it could also be associated with male INFJs, and that's a combination of analyst and supporter. So again, a feeling that they are contributing to the well-being of the company, and they're in a supporting role, but they need to also be given interesting work and to have time. But I think the fundamental insight here is to realize that in the first place, it's going to be unlikely for an INFJ that they will be satisfied in a job that is very fast-paced, that is constantly about being in uncertainty, that is going to require working multiple deadlines at once. It doesn't mean that they can't do it. They can certainly do it, but it's not going to be something that brings them a lot of satisfaction. In fact, it's going to bring them a lot of stress. So it's not a question of competence in terms of intellectual competence. It's in terms of what can satisfy them and keep them feeling good at work, and like they're in control and not constantly out of control. So maybe at some point in the future, I can go a little bit more detail into, you know, analyst / controller or analyst / supporter type jobs. This video is starting to run a little longer, but for example, in a lot of organizations, say in NGOs, for example, there is a role that is called, you know, an advisor. So it's not about being a manager. It's not being about working in operations. It's more like you're a specialist in the field. So for example, you can be a specialist in human rights, or you could be a specialist in safeguarding, or you can be a specialist in peace building. And you have your office, You're not managing people, but you're consulted by management and by various staff to contribute to strategies, contribute to the building of programs, but more almost like in a consultative capacity, except that you're not necessarily a consultant, although there's an option for an INFJ, certainly. It's something that we could also talk about, a freelance consultant, but within an organization having this role of advisor or specialist, I think is good because you keep as much of your freedom as possible while still benefiting from all the advantages of having a 9 to 5. But you're not going to be micromanaged. So your control is tight, that's fine. And you're not going to be pressed for time for deadlines as much as if you were like under a strong kind of, pushy manager. So that the time aspect would also be more or less manageable indeed. I'll go into more detail about it next weekend or during the week if I have time and if you guys express some interest. But in any case, enjoy the rest of your Sunday, guys. I hope you find this useful, and I'll see you soon. Don't forget my Patreon page, if you want to suggest videos for the future. Bye-bye.